Hey Shadow Hunters, it is Gavin Seim, and today I'm going to show you 3 secrets to editing black and white that you're probably not using, or you're at least not using enough. If you're like me, you've probably looked at great images from the black and white darkroom days and from the masters and the greats of black and white, and you're like, there's just something about it. What am I missing? The first secret to black and white is you start editing your black and white in camera. Bear with me, this might sound like a cop-out, but I'm going to carry this all the way through to our final edits, as well as show you some tips for how I'm editing in Lightroom, as well as using tools in Photoshop to do more advanced atmospheric black and whites edit. But I want to start here in camera. If I'm out here with my X100, say, and I'm shooting in the street, that's great. I don't have a lot of lens options. I know what I'm getting. I know that this 35mm equivalent lens is sharp and it's going to give me consistent results. So I'm now thinking about exposing for rays of light, for atmosphere. But there's another way to get atmosphere. The second way to get atmosphere is in choosing my lens. This Helios 44-3, an old Russian lens, you can get these pretty cheap on eBay. It's a rough lens. It's not a super sharp lens. If I contrast this to something like my Fuji 90mm, which is one of my favorite portrait lenses. So here I am with these 2 different contrasts. Just like in the old days, we would edit with the lens we chose. We'd even have to edit with the enlarger lens we chose in the darkroom, with the chemicals, with the tints. And so what we don't realize when we look at these classic darkroom images is there was so much editing going on in terms of the atmosphere and the way that the photographer wanted to convey their shadow. Here is a photo taken on the X100, right? 35mm equivalent, sharp, detailed. I know what to expect. If you take something like this photo, on the other hand, this was taken on this Helios 44-3. And you can see there's flaring, there's softness, there's a lot of stuff going on, but we've created this atmosphere. Number 2 in the 3 things you should be doing to edit is carrying through that atmosphere of how we edit in camera. So if I take this image that I just looked at and we say, okay, I've got this image, it was shot on the Helios. You can see it's kind of soft. It's not that razor sharp that I would get on something like a 90mm f2 or some fancy expensive prime lens. I'm using that to my advantage here. Now I can go through and decide how I want to edit. So if I go through something like Silver 4, which is usually where I'm going to start with an edit, is the Silver 4 presets in Lightroom or in Capture One. I can just start browsing and say, okay, what is completing that look? Let's go to some of the Filmic Silver looks, and I could even go to Filmist as well, which has some black and whites. I can think about, do I want more grainy? Do I want a brighter kind of feel? So let's say I settle on something like Silver Skin, and we say, well, yeah, there's no contrast, Gavin, but that's the beauty. When you start editing in camera, you're actually coming back and you're continuing that edit in your channels, in your post-production, and then the other tips that I'm going to show you. And that brings us to number 2, and that's edit with your channels and your details in the raw file. So by starting with this great edit in camera, now I can come in and say, all right, I'm gonna put silver skin on this, but I want something more. I wanna bring out more contrast. So I'm gonna start playing with the channels down here. Editing with channels is the equivalent of the way we put photo filters on our lenses, our black and white filters, like yellow 12, things like that. So having those here in sliders, and of course in digital we can do even more and faster, but we're doing the same kind of thing. So by controlling this, I can say, no, let's bring in some contrast by controlling how dark her lips are. Look at how much difference this is making. Let's not push it too far because we'll get weirdness. But we're darkening the lips. We can control the yellows and the shadows of how it's affecting her skin tones with orange and yellow, and kind of mix this up. Again, don't push too far, you will screw things up. You gotta be careful about how far you push these. I can then mix that with things like the clarity slider, dehaze, blacks, contrast, and stuff like that. The preset in Lightroom, if I had shot a really sharp image, I probably would have just said, yeah, it's fine. But I'm coming in with an image that's not really sharp. I'm coming in with a vintage lens image, and I don't want to take away all the atmosphere. I just want to balance that out a little bit. So whatever you're taking in camera, you then want to come in, and in step 2, you want to think about how you're using presets and sliders and colors to mix the light. Let's look at another example here. This was taken on the X100. So it's fairly sharp. We don't have any of this atmosphere fuzziness, lens flare, it's sunset, the light's pretty good. So what do I do with this to edit it? I'm gonna start in the same way. And what I mean by that is I'll start going over and finding a mix. So let's say I go here and I find a mix that I like HDR Silver, okay? So I run HDR Silver 2 on this from the Silver 4 pack. And I'll put links to these tools as well as the free packs. Like of Silver, there's a free pack on my website and you can download it and play with it, because by mixing those channels in different ways and having those presets, whether you make your own or you have presets like Silver, you're gonna save a huge amount of time and you're gonna be more creative. At this point, I'm not really trying to restore clarity, but I'm still gonna do that same thing with channels, because I can come in and control contrast in a massive way by, for example, the greens. If I darken the greens and then lighten the yellows, I'm creating contrast in this cornfield, in the water, and here. Look at the way we're affecting our highlights and shadows here. So we're controlling this in a way that brings texture into the image and more atmosphere into the image, and then we can combine that with things like adjusting further shadow, highlight, exposure, etc. And then I can make decisions like, well, how do I want to crop it? Do I want sky, or do I want to cut the sky out and like leave a little to the imagination? Here, I like sky, but maybe not quite that much. So I'm just gonna pull it down a little bit so that the emphasis, the eye is drawn right to these boats, but we have a lot of texture in the foreground. The problem that you then have is the more you've done in camera, the better your black and white is. And frankly, most of what we're talking about today applies to color, but it's particularly important in black and white. Let's actually go and take another portrait. And let's just do something again like the silver skin on this portrait. So here's a portrait here, again shot on a Helios. And you can see we kind of have that swirly background. We kind of have that soft texture. If I compare that to this image of the same model shot on a 90mm, and also converted with silver presets, you can see there's a lot of difference. There's a completely different aesthetic to these two. And one is not right and one is not wrong. The thing is, by choosing your optic, number one, is start your editing in camera, and number two, carry that through to dealing with channels and subtleties of color better, and combining that with the natural atmosphere of whatever lens. These two photos here are completely different and both have their own atmosphere, and we're gonna come back to it because I wanna show you one more thing as we go into the third step. And that is, you carry through the atmospheric editing to the final edit. And this is what was happening in so many of the darkroom photos that I think we take for granted. When you watch videos and studies and you read books like by Ansel Adams, there's a huge discussion of the chemicals you use to get tints, to get hues, how you're bringing out blacks, how you're bringing out highlights. And so when you see this depth created in these photos where it's like, why does my photo just look like I snapped a photo, and their photo, even though it's of something plain and ordinary, has depth? And what it comes down to is atmosphere. So in number one, starting with atmosphere and the lenses. In number two, doing your base edit really well. So if I come to this photo here, which is pretty good, but maybe not mind-blowing, and I go here and say, okay, how can I edit this to get a nice look? All right, let's do just a good, clean edit, like this one right here, IQ Silver, Auto Matte from Silver 4. I'm gonna pull my exposure down a little bit. I'm gonna say, okay, this looks good. What's my clarity? Everything looks pretty good. There's really nothing wrong with the edit. The problem is when I look at it, it doesn't make me think, oh, there's like a complexity to it. That's where the third phase of editing, and that's when we leave Lightroom entirely. You can do some of this atmospheric editing using masks and layers in Capture One or in Lightroom. I'm actually gonna take this into Photoshop, because when you start getting into layers, you are going to get a whole different result in your atmospheric edits. And the layers in Photoshop are more akin to how we would layer different chemicals and mix things in the darkroom. I'm actually gonna restore the color. I'm gonna use an add color back in to go to Photoshop. So it's leaving all the other edits like dynamic range and tone that I did alone, but it's gonna bring my color image into Photoshop because I wanna retain the color channels for that edit. I'm gonna run the BlackRoom tool. Users of BlackRoom that want a little more feedback. So pay attention to this one if you want a little more of a nuance in why I'm going and doing a BlackRoom edit or a layer edit. You don't have to use BlackRoom for this. You could be doing similar atmospheric edits manually with layers. But just like presets, by using actions, I get more creativity and options faster, which allows me to try more things. So let's come in and look at it. Here I've ran the BlackRoom base action, and you can see it's over here in my layers, and it's put all this stuff here and just done a basic black and white conversion from what I gave it from Lightroom. What I really need to do though is draw attention to this. So in real life, what I'm gonna do is two things. I'm gonna go to something like a Light Foundry mix, and you can make these yourself. This is just a combination of a whole bunch of different actions from BlackRoom that get different results. But the bottom line of something like BlackRoom, and it's the same if you go and make your own concept of this, of your own work. BlackRoom is a set of tools that's building a group of layers right here in Photoshop and stacking those up and then saying, okay, you can just add things with these other actions. So if I say, I like this, but let's do an HDR base mod. If I click HDR base mod, it's gonna put more dynamic range in the base layer. So it's using the group of layers we've already built, and now we're bringing dynamic range in, okay? The problem that I see now is I'm bringing dynamic range in and things are starting to run together. This is the problem a lot of times with a lot of black and whites. You have a lot of specular highlights, there's no color separating in your eyes, so you really have to draw focus and create atmosphere with the shadows and with where the eyes are going. Edge blur plate, which might seem counterproductive, but I actually want to soften the edges a little bit. In a way, I'm doing atmosphere of motion blurs and vintage lenses. Now I'm going to turn it way down. So what I'm actually going to be doing is just giving a soft glow around the edges, okay? Now I'm going to come in here and say, let's combine that with an ice plate, which is actually going to go down there as well in these pixel plates groups above my edge blur. So I'm combining this edge blur layer right here, which I can control the opacity of, with a layer that's actually bringing in a little more clarity into the scene. This may seem counterproductive, but what you actually do when you stack transparent effects in Photoshop is you get this completely different edit and you start creating atmosphere. What you're gonna find is the more you add on, the more you get. If I go do a deep vignette plate here, you can see that I've added on top of those pixel plates, I just put it right here in the grouping. And this is why BlackRoom is cool, guys, because it just kind of adds these in and it makes it easy. You just kind of click, everything's non-destructive, and you can turn it on or off, play with it, adjust the opacity, etc. So what I'm gonna do is I'm continuing to draw attention. The point is that I can keep adding. So I can change the way the entire black and white is interpreted by going up to the map tweaks in BlackRoom, which will tell me, hey, is it converting all the color to the full tonal range? Is it compressing it to zone 1 to 9 to keep it a little more softer in the highlights and shadows? And you can see how when I click each of these masks, it makes a flatter or a more contrasty. I could also do a low-key map, which is now darkening. I think the key here is more in darkening than anything else, because the more we're darkening this, the more we're getting an atmosphere. And by editing it for atmosphere and taking it through these 3 steps of editing that start in camera, that carry on into how we edit the raw, and then go into a layer-based atmospheric edit in Photoshop. You could do similar in Luminar. It makes all the difference in the world. Let's come back to this photo from the atmospheric Helios 44.3 that I showed you in Lightroom. We're gonna take it straight into Photoshop with the colors that we edited in Lightroom and just do an edit. So I'm gonna start a BlackRoom to convert this to black and white. And the thing is, by doing this, we have way more control over how to extend that atmosphere further that we started in the camera. So we have our initial conversion and it's kind of coming across a little dark. So being that it's a little dark, I'm actually gonna go to here and do a lift light curve. So this is gonna add this lighter curve into here. And we might say, well, it's almost too light now. So I'm gonna do the Sweet Skin Tones black and white filter, which is then gonna add a bit more contrast to that skin. And I'm gonna turn it down just a little bit. Now I can continue going through things like, hey, let's add an edge blur plate. We already have a fairly blurry background, and I'm just gonna enhance that even more by doing it this way. And you can see, here's my mask plate. Let's actually click the mask and paint black over that part of it in the mask, which we've selected, the edge blur. and make sure it's not affecting her face too much. Everywhere else, it looks pretty amazing. Then let's go back and run that deep vignette plate. That's going to add yet another layer, which is vignetting. And I can actually just move that layer around if I want. I can resize it and make it look exactly the way I want so it covers where I want. I could change blending modes and all this stuff. But you see what we're doing. We're now drawing more and more attention to our model and letting the background and all the surrounding objects kind of become a cone. Okay, so now I'm going to do a ice light plate down below, which is going to bring a little more sharpness and detail back into this whole thing, because this lens wasn't actually very sharp. To offset that even more, I'm going to blur the surrounding area a little more by adding the Dreamlight plate, which does more than just blurring, it's affecting the way light mixes. And you can see it's almost like we've put a softening filter on, but what I'm going to do is go down to that layer and I'm going to mask it out on her face. So I'm going to paint black here because this lens is already fairly soft. I'm going to use it to enhance her skin, but on the fabrics and on the details, I'm going to mask it out, and on the hair so that we retain the detail there. This combination where we're taking softness, we're taking hardness, we're taking sharpness, we're taking lightness, we're taking darkness. This third step is huge. When you edit atmospherically, sometimes it might seem counterproductive because one layer is adding a little softness and then you're putting another layer to add sharpness and you're mixing it and mixing it and mixing it. But I'm telling you, when you stack those layers and when you start mixing those intelligently, the results are magical. A lot of times people want me to give this exact formula for black and white. And the reality is it doesn't work that way. The reason I make tools like this is not to do all the work for you, it's to make it so you can try 10 times more things in the same amount of time so that you can find the right result for the visualization you want. And we're mixing that entire scene to make it work better. And that gives us a profoundly different result than if we only edited the same photo here in black and white in Lightroom. I'm just going to finish this by putting a little bit of a grain layer on. And the beauty of doing all this in Photoshop, when you get into these more complex edits, is I can adjust opacities. I can turn things on and off in ways that in Lightroom would not be as efficient, and Capture One would not be as efficient. Here's a final case in point of all three of these, and it's on my photograph of the birds. I want you to look at this photo. Here was my raw, and here is just a quick silver edit in Silver4 and Lightroom. We have an image that really is strong. The atmosphere is created less by the lens and more by how the photo was taken. So it's not always about putting on a vintage lens or something like that. Getting the edit started in camera is about how you visualize and plan. In this case, getting that little bit of blur on these birds changes the entire aesthetic of the image because it has that sense of urgency and that sense of motion. But then I went through and did a final edit in Photoshop with BlackRoom, with layers. And this is the final result that will be going to international competition this year. There's more grittiness happening. There's more tone happening. There's more emphasis on where I'm putting shadows and how I'm using those. And there's more drawing the eye. The clock tower is really bright. The birds kind of swirling around it, the blurring, the darkness in the sky. There's a little bit of a sense of foreboding. The shadows and the people passing in the foreground are very subtle. There's not an emphasis on, hey, let's put a ton of dynamic range in. There's actually an emphasis on toning them down and starting with an edit that has great dynamic range, but then actually bringing that full circle once we have the control and pulling some of that dynamic range out, letting it fall into shadow and giving us that higher level of control. Those are the three key elements that I think are critical to making a great black and white. Starting with atmosphere in the camera, second with a great edit, and third with a final edit for atmosphere, which yes, you can do some of those atmospheric edits in the raw editor, but if you have a great image, I think you're gonna find that by going to something like Photoshop, using layers, especially if you have a tool like BlackRoom, and I'll put a link to that in the comments if you wanna check it out, but you can do all these layers and vignettes and things manually, and the key with a great tool is not an AI that makes a photo for you. The key to creating your art in a great black and white is being able to create the atmosphere that you need for a scene. And so that when that goes to print, when that goes to display, people are seeing that and they're like, wow, there's just something about it. Just like you feel when you see these great black and whites from the greats. They didn't come out of the camera magical. They were editing throughout the entire process just like we're doing here, but with different tools. I hope you guys found this useful. We'll see you next time. Hit that like and subscribe button and let me know your favorite way to edit black and whites for Atmosphere.